So I come from Australia, as you can probably tell. Yes. So I'll tell you a story about Australia. So a young man goes walking in the outback, and he's walking for a few hours, and he hits some very rough terrain. And he thinks, oh, I'll push on. I can get through this. So he keeps walking for a few hours, and he's getting a bit worried because he's running low on water and the terrain hasn't changed much. And after a while, he runs into a shepherd, which is quite fortunate because he was low on water. And he bumps into the shepherd, and the shepherd quite kindly takes him in, gives him some water and some food, and offers that he stay with him for the night. And he does, and the next day he decides to stay with the shepherd just to recuperate, reserve his energy for the walk back. And he's shadowing the shepherd over the course of the day. And he notices that every now and again the shepherd drops down, digs a small hole in the ground, plants a seed, and then walks away. And he says to the shepherd after a few repetitions of this activity, "Mate, what are you doing?" And he said, "Well, as you can tell, it's pretty rough ground here. And I'm planting seeds in the hope that I can re-establish the ecosystem. Start to grow a forest in this place once again." So anyway, at the end of the day, they part company. The young man walks back to civilization, and they're all good. Now, many years later, the young man decides, I'm going to go back and see how the shepherd's getting on. And he goes out to the same area. And as he's walking out there, he notices the beginnings of this very beautiful little forest starting to take hold. Young trees, there's some birds in the trees, there's some flora, fauna, and it's really taking shape. And he keeps looking for the shepherd. And finally he comes upon him. But instead of a shepherd, there's a beekeeper. And he says to the bloke, "Mate, what happened? When I left you a few years ago, you were a shepherd. Why the change?" And he said, "Well, look, I noticed as the plants started coming through the ground that the sheep were either walking on them or they were starting to eat them." He said, "So I needed to make a change, and I decided to become a beekeeper. A little bit more dangerous, but a little less maintenance, and I could make a few bucks on the side." He said, "But more importantly, I noticed that the bees were able to cross-pollinate and help me more rapidly, establish the ecosystem." He said, "Quite simply, mate, by making a change myself, I was better able to influence the context around me." Now, I suppose my objective today is kind of to turn you into beekeepers. And by that, I simply mean that we do a lot of analyses with numbers. And I often say to my colleagues at Merck Group that if finance is the home of numbers, then HR is definitely the home of text. And I'm hoping today I can inspire you, or at least demystify, text analytics. So a little bit about Merck Group. It's not important that you know what Merck Group does, but I do want to make two key points. And one is, you can see here, we have over 50,000 people in a number of countries. And my first point is this: that is a level of complexity that exceeds human understanding, undoubtedly. But it's not beyond a machine learning algorithm to identify patterns in that complexity. And that's what machine learning algorithms are very good at doing. The second point I want to make for you is that we are a science and technology company. We have the aspiration of being the innovative science and technology company. And to do that, you need happy scientists. And one of the challenges that some of my colleagues were noting in HR was that we tend to employ these very intelligent, highly specialized scientists, but when they don't have vertical growth opportunities and we can't move them laterally, they end up leaving. And picking up on the point I made a moment ago about the scale of complexity at Merck Group, it is beyond a HR business partner to turn to somebody like me and say, "Adam, these are all the potential job opportunities for you globally that we could transition you into, which reinvigorates my career and ensures that I stay with the company longer." So the challenge was, how do we solve this? So I had the idea of something of a two-step model. The first was to identify who's going to leave us We need to focus our efforts. In a company of 50,000 people, we probably have around 20,000 scientists. And I can't have a HR business partner walk around with 20,000 people day in, day out. So I needed to focus my efforts on particular scientists. And to do that, I suggested that we use a machine learning algorithm to predict who was most likely to leave in the next 3 to 6 months. But I often say with a good analytics project, you've got to answer 2 questions. The first is, so what? And then the second is, now what? And I feel like the now what was the trickier bit, and that was step 2 here. And that is to say, okay, Adam, we recognize that you're thinking of leaving, and these are the full spectrum of opportunities at Merck Group that we could potentially transition you into to reinvigorate your career, areas that would benefit from your skills and your expertise. And by putting these 2 steps together, we then enabled the HR business partner to very surgically focus their efforts on at-risk employees and have very personalized conversations with them. So, I want to share with you a little experiment that I ran earlier this year that speaks to the mechanics of text mining. Now, for those of you that don't like coding, I'm sorry. There will be a little bit of code here. But the good news is you don't have to be a coder to appreciate what I'm doing here. And I'm hoping that I can present it in a way that makes it accessible and perhaps demystifies some of the jargon that goes with this area. So what I did was I took just 35 job descriptions from 2 of our core businesses. One is pharmaceuticals, which we're very well known for, but the other is life sciences. And we tend to operate as separate companies. So I took 35 job descriptions, about 17 from healthcare and 18 from life sciences. I've got the exact numbers here. And then I ingested the text from those job descriptions into R. And we started by doing some basic cleaning and pre-processing of the data. So what that involves is, you can see the words on the left and the code is highlighted on the right. Let me just start with the steps on the left. So we tokenize each word. That simply means we break each word up as its own entity. So for instance, if I have a job description of 100 words, they then become 100 lines on an Excel spreadsheet. Think of it like that. Then I reduce all of the words to lowercase. I remove all of the punctuation and numerical elements. I remove stop words. So stop words are things like the, that, the, I think I already said. And then I performed a thing called stemming. So stemming is an activity where you reduce a word to its base function. Let me give you a simple example. Running, runs, ran, they all become the word run. Okay, so we're trying to reduce the dictionary to like terms. Then we move on to turning the text into numbers. And we use a statistic called TF-IDF values. And I'm actually going to show you how we calculate these. It sounds far fancier than it actually is. It's quite simple. What we do is follow this formula. Now, I've put an example on screen here, and that is, consider we're using a job description that's got 100 words, and we're after the word biology, and it appears 3 times in that 100 words. The term frequency, which is the first half of the equation, is simply 3 divided by 100, which, as you can see there, 0.03. Nothing too fancy so far. The second form of the formula is the IDF. So this is the inverse document frequency. And here what we're doing is we're emphasizing words that are rarer in the full corpus of text that we're analyzing. So the formula here, again, assuming we have 10,000 job descriptions and the word biology appears 100 times, we slot those figures into the formula at the bottom, which is 1 plus log 10 of 10,000 divided by 100, and we get the value to the right, 5.6. We then multiply those 2 elements together And as you can see, the word biology is then converted into the value 0.168155. And we essentially do that for every word that we analyse in all of the job descriptions that we looked at. Okay? That's step one out of the technical stuff. Step two is then to determine how similar documents are to one another. So we're using the values we just calculated to then determine what's called the cosine similarity. Let me give you an example. Assume we have two documents with these two words, supply and transparency. Now, based on the TF, IDF values, we give them these values here in the table. Now, taking those values, we then plot them in multi-dimensional space, and we determine, looking at where those two documents come out in a multi-dimensional plot, what is the angle of difference, think simple geometry at high school, between those two lines. Yeah? And that tells us how similar or dissimilar those two documents are to one another. So a perfect match, two identical documents, would have a cosine similarity value of 1, and then very dissimilar, highly different, would be around the 0.1, just under. Okay? And then we removed document pairs that were below 0.4. So this was something I established. So I said, when the cosine similarity value is below 0.4, just get rid of it. I'm not interested. These are dissimilar roles, and there's very little relationship between the two of them. I just want to look at pairings that are above 0.4 so we can focus our attentions. And these are some of the results we ended up with, just looking at 35 different job descriptions in 2 lines of business. So we found matches in healthcare, we found matches in our life sciences business. What was interesting is I had hoped that we would find a match between roles in healthcare and life sciences so that we could promote some of those inter-business transfers. It didn't happen, not with these roles. Yep. Yep. So I'm going to repeat the question for the chat with the camera. So you tell me if I'm getting this right. Did I look at the sentiment of the language used? No, I didn't look at sentiment because, in my opinion, emotion wasn't important when looking at these documents. So creating synonyms. Did I look at synonyms? Ultimately, I don't. Yeah. So it's a good point, and the language used is very specific to the domains. So I actually walked away from this experiment, and I said to the scientists I was working with, we have a third business called Performance Materials, in which we have a lot of scientists working on technology, LCDs, semiconductors, and things like that. And I said, I have a feeling we would get more matches between life sciences and performance materials than we would between healthcare, where we're developing drugs, which is very different to the other scientific domains that we have in the other 2 businesses. So it's a bit of an ongoing line of pursuit. Did you want to ask another one? Yep. Yes. Yep. Yes. Yep. Yes. Okay. I think that would be somewhat related to, say, this example on screen, where I've created a matrix. It's kind of like a heat map of similarities between the pairings of roles. And the closer you get to red, the more similar the two jobs are. And one of the matches I found, which I've highlighted on screen here, it's in tiny text, for which I apologise, but it was two roles. One was called Application Development Manager, and then the second one was called a Microfluidic Manager. And these were highly related, but had previously been unconsidered as potential matches. And what was evident when you went back to the job descriptions, they both required experience in chemistry, or one of the hard sciences. They wanted experience in commercializing processes, and there were a number of other pieces of language which were quite similar. So even to the lay person like myself that knows nothing about those two jobs, you could begin to see some of the similarities, and then I could socialize that with the experts in the business. So perhaps a way of kind of addressing what you were picking up on. So even here with 35 jobs, we were able to find opportunities for transition that had not been considered previously. In a company of 50,000, we could open up a multitude of opportunities to people. Like, the opportunities really are, I won't say limitless, but infinitely greater than we are able to comprehend presently. This was another way in which I visualized the outputs. So the red dots were essentially roles in the healthcare business, and then the blue dots were roles in the life sciences business. And I thought if I was to scale this technology in the future, I would probably visualize it for the organization in a network so people could see where they sit in the network, and then all the other roles that potentially branch off their position so that they could pursue those opportunities potentially proactively or be walked through that process with a HR business partner. So where to next? This is also code for what did I do wrong? So in terms of the job similarities, it was a convenient sample of 35 jobs. As I said earlier, I would love to do it with, say, 35,000 because the process is exactly the same. Yeah, I probably just need better hardware. I used a cosine cutoff of 0.4, which arguably is somewhat conservative. You know, if you were to increase that to say 0.6, 0.7, then I think we could have a lot more confidence in the matches and better enable the HR business partners to have very personalized conversations with the individuals that they're approaching. So I think we could do that quite easily. As I mentioned on the last slide, I would like to put it into a network so that it's a bit more user-friendly to interact with, because I doubt we'd say in Australia, every man and his dog wants to look at a correlation matrix that looks like a heat map. Yeah? Whereas the network, it's a bit more engaging, it's a bit more intuitive, and people could probably interact with that more readily. Job descriptions, are they the best medium through which to characterize a position? Maybe, but potentially not. So in the healthcare business, we have a regulatory requirement to update the job descriptions on I think it's almost a biannual basis. So they are arguably semi-current. Yeah, but in the life sciences business, for instance, I had a hiring manager say to me, "Adam, you can have this, but I haven't used it in 6 years. You know, we haven't recruited somebody for that job in 6 years." So arguably it was well out of date. Yeah. What I was thinking on that basis was, well, what about if we use information that is more current? And as I said at the outset, I think HR is just alive with data sets that we do very little with. One of those data sets at Merck Group is performance objectives. So we spend a bit of time at the beginning of the year identifying what our role will encompass for the next 9 to 12 months. And then we effectively, many of us, just put it aside until the performance appraisal period at the end of the year. And I was thinking, well, what if we were to take that information and then I could then turn to people proactively and say, these are the 20 people globally who you may not be aware of that are working on the exact same topics that you are. You know, you proactively provide people with information which enables them to network and potentially recognize synergies within the company that they were previously unaware of. So that's something we'd like to experiment with moving forward. I think that's probably enough preaching from me. I'm open to questions. Thank you.